My name's Charlie Halford. I work as an architect at Ixxus, and I'm here today to talk to you about modularity. First of all, what am I going to cover today? We're going to go over modularity in general. We're going to describe how it can be used to help boost your productivity, specifically as a developer and as part of your development workflow, and how its emphasis on enabling reuse can help reduce support costs and help you develop an ecosystem of interdependent modules that can really help you reduce cost and develop better, more successful applications. After that, I'm going to go through a few projects that exist in the community, both open source and commercial ones, and describe how they've approached modularity, what kind of plugin systems they use, and how those kind of plugin systems can be applied to the concept of modularity in Alfresco, and what the commonality between them is. After that, I'm going to go through a more practical application, so shifting thinking to using modules to develop solutions for Alfresco, with Alfresco as an immutable object, as an app server, if you will, and just changing our thinking to using Alfresco more in that manner, even though it's not currently enabled to do that technically. Then we're going to talk about some of the extension best practices that I picked up that might be useful for application in projects where modularity is a goal. And then finally, we're going to have a look about what we might want to use in the future, how we might alter the Alfresco application and the surrounding infrastructure to help us deploy applications in a more modular fashion in the future. So before I start the main content, I just want to present this as a warning. There probably are some contentious ideas in this presentation, and I think for me that's a good thing. I'm not presenting them as fact. I'm really presenting them here to demonstrate some of the things I've picked up, and hopefully to get some feedback on what we think is a good idea for modularity in Alfresco, what works and what doesn't, and what other people's experiences have been. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about modularity in general and what it means. So when we first look at modularity, one of the prime use cases for it is that of reducing the copying of code, so the duplication of business requirements and functions that we often see when we're developing solutions on Alfresco and solutions in general. So reuse is a really powerful thing. It can help us cut development time on projects from many thousands of man days down to almost zero if we're able to correctly identify those bits of common functionality that we can pull out into a module or set of modules, which we can then deploy to different people in different circumstances. I mentioned composition there. Composition is a key part of modularity, and it's probably one of the harder things to get your head around when you're attempting to create a modular system. The second part of modularity, which is also incredibly important and also very useful, is that by enforcing or encouraging modularity, we're also encouraging good object-oriented design. So by defining a module, by effectively building a barrier around that module, what we're doing is equivalent to the low-level idea of object encapsulation. So we are essentially defining an interface to our module, which we interact with that module through, and we put ourselves in a position whereby if we need to change the code inside that module, because we have well-defined interfaces, we can control that change rippling throughout the rest of our product. And that's something that you can often find quite difficult when you're developing a large bespoke application that doesn't include some of these concepts of modularity. So I've touched on it just before, but if you are developing an extension for Alfresco, some customizations or an entire solution, making everything bespoke has a cost. And I say that because the cost mainly comes in two parts. One, in the reuse that you're missing out on. So if you do find that you're developing solutions where you have some common components, and I found on most projects you almost certainly have common components that run across different client engagements, the cost comes there in the maintenance. If you're updating one client with one particular code base that has function X, for example, then another client doesn't receive that same level of support. Their specific implementation might be done in a slightly different way, and you're effectively wasting money by having to support two identical features. And the other way is in encouraging, as I was talking about previously, encapsulation, good object-oriented design, and helping you to ensure that the maintainability of those components stays good. So modularity not only helps us with reuse, it encourages good object-oriented design. And with these two primary drivers for modularity in mind, what we want to do is start driving down the cost of creating modules. So what I've found is when we've started creating modules for clients, initially when we did it, the ideas were good. Everybody could see the benefits. But what that translated into was a line item on the estimate that we'd give out to a client that would add a number of days, maybe even weeks, to a given bit of development in order to split it out into all of the modules that we thought were useful. Now, that might save you days and weeks down the line in maintenance, but it's often a very difficult thing, one, to sell to a client, and two, it's very difficult to encourage developers to want to split their modules if the cost of creating them is so high. So what I'll do later on is demonstrate how we can use some build tools and some clever best practices to really reduce the cost of splitting modules apart, splitting a solution apart, and provide almost a zero cost of doing that. So that's really what we need to do. So I'll start our journey through modularity with Alfresco as a shining example. So Alfresco is a huge reuser of open source projects. If you enjoy looking at Maven dependency trees, which I love doing, you might notice there are 260 modules that Alfresco reuses in creating its product. So without those modules, Alfresco would require a huge amount of development to have even got an initial version. And without all of those modules and other people, so that's third parties maintaining them, the cost of adding new features to Alfresco would be huge, almost insane. So by reusing all of these modules, they avoid reinventing the wheel. It's almost certain that another project out there has done a low-level bit of functionality better because it's had a larger community and a lot longer to mature than home-growing your solution might have. And it also, as I was saying, provides a single place for those modules to be updated so that Alfresco don't have to duplicate the code bases of all of them and update them themselves. So I've borrowed this graph from a gentleman who's very keen and very passionate about modularity. And what it shows us is as we try and break apart a very coarse-grained system into lots of different modules, we have some thinking to do. It's not a process which is entirely free of design. So what this graph shows is along this axis we've got the use of a product or a module. So when I say use, I mean essentially how usable is it to an end user or a consumer of that particular bit of functionality. If it's incredibly useful, so I guess at the extreme end of the scale, we might think Alfresco or maybe an even more specific tool has an immense amount of use to an end user. But the more specific, the more usable it becomes, the larger it gets, and the harder it is to break that into modules. So when we then move along the bottom axis, we can see if we want to enable the maximum amount of reuse, we essentially have to, at an extreme level, break every possible feature down into its own module. Now, that comes with its own costs, of course. As you can see here, one of the biggest ones is the complex dependency graph you need to maintain if you're going to go down to that level of detail. And often, when things become so incredibly reusable, they're actually quite difficult to pull together into a solution that actually does something concrete for an end user. So ultimately, what that gives us is this sweet spot in the middle. So we don't want a solution to be so coarse-grained, so dependent on its end use case that it becomes useless to other people, but we don't want to get into a position whereby our underlying modules are so focused on reusability that they can't have an application. So can reuse be bad? And I think the answer to that is yes. Can modularity be bad? Yes, it can. But again, it's all about how you approach it. So making a module making a module too reusable reduces its usability to the end user. And those complex dependencies can add a cost. So if you've ever used a dependency management system, you probably run into the points whereby you might find versioning becomes a bit of a nightmare. One component might depend on version 5 of another component, which then depends on version 6, and it becomes very difficult to manage. So you need to try and avoid getting down to the really low level of detail. But modularity can be good too, and I'm absolutely in favor of the idea that well-designed modularity can really, really improve the speed of development, the speed of onboarding new developers onto your project, and also the design of the solution as well. So once we've made a module too usable, it's reducing its reusability. You can see that, my own experience is that when I first started developing with Alfresco, modularity wasn't really considered a thing to do. We'd think of Alfresco as a target for customization, and we'd go ahead and we'd just add all of our customizations in one deployable module. And that's great, especially when you're thinking from a client that only wants a small set of customizations. But as soon as you start scaling that up, as soon as you have a client that really wants to do Alfresco plus a number of other quite heavy, complex bits of functionality, you can really struggle when all of that is one bespoke monolithic blob. So you'll end up in those situations often finding that when you move from client to client or you move from project to project, you'll have some similar problems that you need to solve again, and modularity can definitely help you there. Not using this modularity to help you solve these problems can increase your support, spread your support base, and increase your cost because you've got more code that does almost exactly the same thing to support rather than one place to do it in. So in my previous, in the graph that I showed previously, it talked about weight. So we can define weight as essentially the dependency of a module on its environment. So if I have a particularly heavyweight component, it might be so usable that it's absolutely dependent on the environment that it's sat in. It needs to know all of the system details that it needs to connect to, and it needs all of those in place and effectively unchangeable. The other end of the scale is when you're too lightweight, and you don't depend on any environment because you essentially want your module to be deployed anywhere. You don't want people to have to wade through 10 hours of configuration files to get your module up and running. But that too can cause problems. Making it too lightweight means we tend to delegate to other components and we increase complexity again. So I just want to add a quick note on OSGI. So as I go through the rest of my presentation, we're going to talk about OSGI, and we're going to talk about some of the problems that not using a solution like OSGI would give us. So OSGI provides us a dynamic loading and plugin lifecycle. So currently, if I develop a module for Alfresco, I've got a limited set of lifecycle actions. I don't have an OSGI defined set of interfaces that let us control the installation, uninstallation, starting, stopping, and a number of other different lifecycle actions which are incredibly useful, especially when you get into the situation where you've deployed a module, you realize it's changed the content model of your Alfresco application, and then you can't remove it. So when I talk about this, I suppose I start thinking about the idea of dynamically loading modules, reducing the restart times by essentially allowing us to class load modules directly into a running Alfresco. And I couldn't mention that without talking about the dynamic extensions for our Alfresco project. I played with this. It's really good. At the time I played with it, it didn't have everything you needed to complete a complete development. There were extension points that were missing, but it was definitely a really good start, and it let me deploy OSGI modules directly into Alfresco without restarts. And later on, I think today, I've got another talk. Don't go to that one. Go to Life is Too Short for Endless Restarts, because that looks amazing, and I wish I was going to it. Okay, so I'm going to cover some successful plugin modules. So we've got Jenkins first of all. So I don't know how readable that is back at the back. It should be okay. Essentially, Jenkins allows us to install a number of plugins dynamically at runtime again. Those plugins are very well defined. Jenkins are in an enviable position in that they can specify a set of hooks and extension points for their modules, which isn't as easy for Alfresco to do. Their application server is a lot less complex. There are a lot less moving parts. So developing a plugin for a Jenkins application becomes relatively simple. Other advantages of that, these modules are deployable at runtime. They can depend on each other with either soft or hard relationships. And that can be very powerful if you need to integrate with a module optionally. If module X and module Y both have symbiotic features, then it's very useful to be able to, deploy one independently, so you don't force people to install the world every time you're installing a module, but then also enable integration features as and when the other module becomes available. And it's this composition of plugins that gives real business value in Jenkins. Another well-known plugin system is that of Eclipse itself. So since version 3 of Eclipse, the Equinox engine has delivered OSGI for plugins, and that makes Eclipse a very, very pluggable architecture. Some of the more useful parts of that mean you've got lifecycle tasks that allow you to install and uninstall. The Eclipse core team will eat a lot of its own dog food, and by that I mean it will use plugins to implement its core functionality. So they're constantly using the system they've created, ensuring it's fit for purpose, and also providing a really pluggable, customizable installation. And also a key point there is plugins have their own supporting update site. So this is going to be a common theme we go back to. The ability for an end user to be able to simply browse a website of plugins, click install, and without restart, have that functionality inside their application is incredibly powerful. And not only does it drive uptake of plugins, but it also drives uptake of the underlying platform. And that's a key point I want to continue on with. So I'm just going to quickly rush through this one, as it's a very similar situation. So this is the Atlassian architecture for plugins. Atlassian are a developer of Jira and Confluence, which are an issue tracking system, and a wiki. I don't know if anybody's used it before, but essentially they're using Spring Dynamic modules, which has OSGI under the hood. And again, plugins definitely help drive Atlassian sales. The key bit there is if I've got a system that does 90% of what I need to do, and there's a plugin available that does that full 100%, then I'm definitely going to want to buy into that system. The existence of those plugins can often go that extra mile, which can help people decide whether or not they want to use a given system. And again, they've got a marketplace and a one-click install screen. So the commonality between those is dynamic deployment. All of those do dynamic deployment into their respective applications. They dog food their own plugin systems. And the ease of installation means that end users can take a module and reuse it and get up and running instantly. And finally, they also help manage dependencies between components so that you don't have to. And ultimately, what we care about here is that they really drive product uptake. So now I'm going to move on to a more Alfresco-specific set of slides. So with modularity in mind and some of the other plugin modules that I've just demonstrated, how can we start shifting our thinking to using Alfresco itself as a platform that we deploy to rather than a product which we customize? So if we try and think differently around it, when I first learned to develop on Alfresco, customization was the key word. And I think for a certain set of use cases, customization is still relevant. But what customization does is it means you are changing the underlying application. You are deploying a set of deliverables to a client which doesn't look like the Alfresco which was shipped from Alfresco themselves, and it doesn't look exactly like the AMP file or the jar file that you shipped either. It's a combination of both, and in my experience, that when applied over a large deployment, that can lead to problems. So what I'm trying to think about when I'm thinking of modular deployment is the concept of the open-close principle. So Bertrand Meyer and Bob Martin have popularized this idea, and it tends to specifically refer to code-level implementation details, where we think about a given class being closed for modification and open for extension. And I believe all of those principles there apply at a much higher level. So by closing a WAR file for modification, I think we can ensure that our solutions are deployable, reliable, maintainable. Because everything we modify eventually will have a cost. So Martin Fowler has written an article on the concept of a Snowflake server. So a snowflake essentially is a unique thing. You won't have a snowflake that is identical to another one. And a Snowflake server is essentially an anti-pattern. And what we want to do is avoid that kind of anti-pattern. We want to ensure that when we are deploying applications, we know exactly what we are deploying, and that for given version 2, 3, 4, we know that we have X number of files in it, we know all of the functionality that's gone into it, and we can track the Git commits and ensure that when we do see problems with it, we can trace it all the way back. If we, further on, I'll go on to some of the deployment mechanisms, but ultimately, none of our current deployment mechanisms allow us to treat a WAR file as essentially a completely hands-off thing. So the cost of producing Snowflake servers or potentially Snowflake servers is that you can run into provenance issues, audit issues, and reproducibility problems. So now I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the different deployment targets that are available. I'm going to go into these in a bit more detail later on. But the first one on this list is the AMP file. So maybe I can have a quick show of hands. Who here currently deploys using AMPs as their primary mechanism? Okay, that's probably about 50%. So AMPs are the Alfresco supported customization and extension mechanism, and they provide us a way to use to overlay our customizations onto an Alfresco WAR in place, and then deploy that WAR further downstream. Another customization method, an extension method that's often used, specifically when you look at some share pages, some share extensions. I don't know if you looked at the share extras projects. They tend to favor jar files a bit more. Jar files, essentially the idea there is that you drop a jar file with all of the resources that you either want to add into an application or overwrite. You drop them into Tomcat, either in the shared classes directory or inside the web app themselves. And once you've restarted, you then get your functionality again. A third mechanism is using Maven. Maven is a build tool and a dependency management tool, using Maven to generate a new WAR. So Alfresco very kindly provided now a set of transitive dependencies for Maven, so that we can understand what makes up a given Alfresco release, and we've got a WAR file. So what we can do is we can take that WAR file, we can take our jar files, we can link them together with dependencies and say, please overlay one with the other and produce a WAR file on the other end. And then finally, we've got an exploded mechanism of directly overwriting files. So all of these require modification in some way. So what we can do is try and apply some of our thinking around modularity to the platform that we've got. So if our deployment mechanism can't treat our application server as an immutable object, then we can start thinking about it from a slightly higher level and start applying some of those modular principles to our development, so that we try and at least avoid some of the pitfalls. So we want to develop those extensible, reusable components, and we want to ensure that we're building and deploying them repeatably. I don't know if anybody here uses continuous integration to build their AMPs or jar files. That's, to me, essential. You pretty much can't get a repeatable process unless you're testing it somehow, be that with a continuous integration server or a guy sitting there running through your build process. And then once we've got these components, we essentially want to compose them. So this composition produces the solutions that we want to deliver to a client at the end of the day. So some of the other best practices that I've gone over as I've looked at using Alfresco modules and composing modular solutions is that we should try and limit our integration surface. The more Alfresco internal objects that we use in our modules, the more dangerous our solution becomes and the more brittle our solution becomes. Because as soon as we get any sort of change to the underlying objects, be that from an upgrade or from a change to our internal data models to our components, we're going to suffer a big refactoring cost, a big maintenance cost, and potentially support problems further down the line. So my general recommendation, and I'm completely aware that I've never developed a module that sticks to all of these APIs, but the general intention is to provide that mental check in your head. If you are developing a solution can you abstract that solution away from Alfresco internals to just use the foundation APIs, the Java ones, the JavaScript, or perhaps the remote REST or SOAP services? And if you can do that abstraction, then do it. You will isolate yourselves from a lot of problems. But obviously, as any extension goes, we can't always do that. So what we can do instead is just make sure that we are aware that every time we do hit an Alfresco internal, we're aware of the potential costs down the road, and we don't add to those costs without unnecessary thought. Again, with sharing UI, it's a similar situation. I've never created a share extension without having to look into the internals slightly. And then beyond that, when your modules start becoming too complex or overly complex, you've got a few different options. One is to break them apart, put them in different modules. But if they're essentially doing the same, they're providing a correct service, then consider offloading them. Consider bringing them out of Alfresco and performing that action outside of Alfresco so you can avoid some of that complexity. Because Alfresco is in itself a very powerful and complex application, by moving them apart, we can often understand the interfaces between them a bit better and hopefully simplify our overall solution. So I wanted to talk very, very quickly about the module service that's currently inside Alfresco. So whether you use amps or jars, it doesn't matter. If you've got a module properties file inside your application, the module service is going to help you out. And what it does is it can provide a registry at runtime. So obviously at boot time, you see it in your Alfresco logs. You can see your modules starting and doing the work they need to do. What the module service allows us to do is also define optional dependencies if we want to do that. So here we've got a module service, and we're calling getAllModules. And from that, we're simply providing a version of our optional module. And then we can just simply use contains on this module detail to understand if we have modules available at runtime to us. And from there, we can then start composing optional dependencies. Okay, I'm going to rattle through some of the best practices. So at Ixxus, when I started out, we were developing using Ant. We started moving slowly towards Maven, sometimes with Gradle as well. And we found that a good build tool that has reusable components and reusable pieces of best practice is incredibly helpful, in addition to the fact that it provides us dependency management. So what it allows us to do, specifically when I talk about Maven, is provide a configuration hierarchy. So what we do at Ixxus is we essentially have a parent POM. This parent POM is company-wide, and it maintains a number of our plugins and best practices that all of our developers will inherit. So we define our integration tests, we define our license checking, we define a number of check style and code quality metrics, all at a top level, so that whenever a new developer wants to create a new module, all they do is inherit this parent POM, and they pulled in all of our company best practices into one place. And we found that incredibly powerful, because it means you're removing the requirement for every project to set up its own set of best practices. If we need to customize them, we can, but we're essentially templating a project so that when we hit the ground running, we've got everything we need in place to make that solution work. So as part of our use of Maven, we use Jacoco, which is a plugin that allows us to have unit and integration test coverage. So that's very useful. We feed that into SonarQube. I don't know if anybody's used Sonar. Maybe a quick show of hands. Yeah, there's a few in the audience. So that's incredibly useful quality management tool. So we use Maven to push our data into Sonar. We also use H2 database for our integration tests. So we're using the Alfresco Spring integration tests. We found that having an in-process integration test system kind of helps make the debugging effort a little bit quicker for our developers. They can attach a debugger, see where it's going wrong. The overall startup time tends to be a little bit shorter than if you're running your own Jetty server, and that's why we do that. And then finally, archetypes, which are probably one of the best things about Maven. So I was talking about templating before. Archetypes provide the ability to completely template a project. So what we've got, when a developer starts at Ixxus from scratch, they run one command line with the name of our archetype. And what that does is it produces a directory structure on their machine, which gives them a complete Ixxus Alfresco module ready to go. So inside that is also a sample web script that just outputs hello world, a sample content model, which shows them where they need to put their files. And all they do is do a Maven build or a Maven package. They've got a jar file and they're ready to deploy it. So within about 10-15 minutes, if they've got an Alfresco server up and running, they can have one of our modules deployed to Alfresco. Just a quick example of some of that Maven configuration. So Maven is split into phases. So it runs through a compile phase, a test phase, then I can't remember if the packaging or the integration tests come first or second, but essentially what we're doing here is we're saying we're binding our goal of doing an integration test along the entire application into that phase in Maven. How am I doing for time? Okay, so now we're going to talk quickly about packaging options, and I'm hoping to get a bit of interaction as well here because I haven't actually used AMPs for quite a while, so I'm probably not the authority on them. But AMPs are the recommended way of packaging Alfresco customisations and extensions. So why do I think that is? Well, one is namespacing. They allow you to bring all of your code and development efforts together and ensure that they don't conflict with other code and development efforts. And another really important one is it provides a single bundle. So I was talking about dependencies earlier on. One of the problems with jar files is that if you've got a lot of dependencies and you're trying to deploy those into an Alfresco application, you've essentially got to copy all of the jar dependencies into Alfresco. So what AMPs allow you to do is pull all of those dependencies into one nice friendly bundle and allow you to deploy that to different applications. So I think typically this is very useful if you're distributing just an AMP file to a client so that they can apply it to their own Alfresco installation. I think that's probably why we don't use it so much, as we tend to deploy Alfresco for them. But can anybody give me another useful point of an AMP? Have I missed anything from here? Uninstalling. Okay, so you have the ability in an AMP file to pull all of the customized files out of your customized WAR and essentially leave your WAR file as a vanilla Alfresco. So that's very useful. If I do this presentation again, I'll include it. Yep. You can overlay. Yes. Okay, so using the new Alfresco Maven SDK, we can overlay AMP files onto WAR files before we actually produce the underlying WAR file. Yeah. Okay, so that essentially that kind of brings me on to this next one. So that ability is incredibly useful. So jar files also allow us to do that that situation. So essentially, what we're talking about here is a number of different containers of executable code and resources. So jar files have enjoyed support from the Java community since pretty much the inception of Java. They're interoperable pretty much all over the Java ecosystem, and you'll find that the tool chain for using jar files is very complete. So similar to AMP files, jar files can overlay WARs. When we're overlaying WARs, we don't have the ability to uninstall. So that's a particular deficiency. But I think when you start working with jar files and you're producing WARs, I I think what I've found is we've started to think of a WAR file as something that will never be touched. Once we've got a WAR file, we're not going to touch it again. That should be deployed to your development server, your test server, your integration test server, and your production server. It should be one version. All of the properties should be external to that WAR file, and that will allow you to reproduce your deployment process all the way through to production. So that installation process for us is essentially the same as generating a new WAR file. One of the huge disadvantages is it's really complex to compose dependencies. Our other deployment method is copying files, so that's exploding a Tomcat WAR, overwriting files in it, and restarting Tomcat. So this can be potentially quite dangerous. It's actually quite useful when you're running a development environment on your local machine because you're a lot quicker. You don't have to wait for that compile and deployment cycle. And we can make that even quicker if we use something like spring-loaded. So at Ixxus, we've just introduced a spring-loaded integration with Maven, so that when we compile our files in our Maven POMs, is automatically updated in the developer's local Alfresco instance. Rebel also offers the ability to do that as well for a cost. The problem is, if we did this in production, we introduce unpredictability and maintenance problems. So which is best? So it really depends on your deployment workflow. So I probably sound like I'm a proponent of jars, and it's probably just my specific use case. But I don't think that's the case across everything. I think each deployment mechanism absolutely has its place. So you really need to think about your own deployment workflow. What works best for you? Are you deploying WAR files that you need to change on the fly? Do you have a test server that you need to uninstall things from and then reinstall them to? How are you using Alfresco? Jars in general offer more interoperability with third-party projects. Jars, I've said before, enjoy support from across a number of different projects. And another point I just wanted to make, and I think I've already made it, is all of the very powerful module framework inside Alfresco can be used from jars. It's not amps as a deployment mechanism which enable that. And then finally, file copy can be really compelling if you can set up spring-loaded or Rebel. Okay, so how am I doing for time? All right, a few more minutes. So some of the general good practices that I wanted to go over. Understand your core use cases. I think that's probably fair to say amongst any solution you're undertaking with Alfresco. But it really helps you understand where, if you're thinking from a modularity perspective, where you want to split your modules up. Use a build tool that supports dependency management, because otherwise, once you scale up beyond 5 or 10 dependencies, you're really going to need something to manage them. Define your application boundaries. So I talked about limiting our integration surface. So we don't have an OSGI method of defining a specific interface for our components yet. We can't expose a given interface and require that a module implement that interface. So what we can do instead is just ensure that where we do interact with Alfresco, we do it through well-defined boundaries. And finally, on the good practice, release your modules. If you are going to produce a modular ecosystem, release them as first-class citizens. Don't just concentrate on the end client solution. It's incredibly important. It's probably why a number of us are here, and it is ultimately what delivers value to the customer. But enabling your modules to have first-class status amongst your developers increases each module's reliability, and I think that's incredibly important because it enables developers to reuse modules really quickly. They don't have to think, oh, is this going to be production ready? You've got a first-class release, you know it's good, let's use it. So very quickly, where can we go from here? Reducing the modularity cost. We talked about this before. So drive down that cost of creating a module. Drive down the cost of knowing where to split a solution up. Compose, don't customize. So once we move beyond the changing a logo in Alfresco for a given client, and we're into delivering fully fledged solutions, start composing those solutions of the modules that you want to see, be them custom developed modules for a given client or ones you might already have in your IP. 3 is improve your workflow, so drive those times down from getting from that cycle of build, deploy, and test. Thank you. The build, deploy, test cycle can, in some extreme circumstances, take 10 minutes. You can probably move it down to a couple of minutes with an SSD drive on your laptop. But ultimately, other tools and other processes can help you drive that down, and I talked about spring-loaded. And finally, just a quick list of things that I think would be nice to help enable that kind of plugin architecture. So plugins as first-class citizens in Alfresco. So a plugin is part of the Alfresco system. It's treated the same as other Alfresco modules. And alongside that, core functionality implemented in plugins as well. So we currently have a number of amps. They're useful. But it would be nice to see some more of the core repo as plugins. And finally, a more powerful plugin lifecycle and potentially dynamic deployment. That would be lovely. Okay, thank you very much. I think we've got time for a few questions, if anybody has any.
I was looking at the dynamic extensions website the other day, and there doesn't seem to be much activity going on, sadly.
Yeah, and that to me is a sad thing. I'd definitely like to see that increase in activity. Ultimately, though, I'd like to see that effort move into Alfresco rather than live as a community-supported module. So yeah, that's definitely something I'd like to see adopted more.
Yeah, you mentioned that you use HSQLDB to do your integration tests.
Yep.
Is that something you've home-baked, or is that a sort of publicly available library to be able to actually just run integration tests against Alfresco on HSQL?
Yes. So it's not something we've home-baked. It's something we've taken the pattern from the Ant days when we used to run Alfresco Spring integration tests. If you Google for it, there's a number of methods that show you how to use that. And effectively, what we do is we use a community-supported bridge module to bridge the SQL in Alfresco with the version of H2 that we're using under the hood. So that's very powerful.
Allows you to do that. Maven SDK also allows you to integrate with HQDB, and it's supported by Alfresco.
Okay, no more? Well, thank you very much.